Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 17, Aeonwyrm. Aeonwyrm. "We need his blood," Shadia said, while hastily rummaging through his duffel and removing several rolled sections of leather, unfurling them to reveal dozens of rows of corked glass vials. "What?" shouted Piecora. This time, Shadia did not stop his work. "We need to draw his blood, and we must do it quickly. I fear we may have attracted attention at this point, and we'll have adherents and retrievers on us before we know it." Piecora reached for Shadia, but Karui caught her arms and pulled her back. "Please, Pia, trust him," she hushed. "I fear that we are on the edge of a knife, and there are things in motion right now that we cannot understand. Both success and failure hang in the balance. Please let him work." "He's taking the old man's blood. The body is fresh. There may still be a chance that we can save him." "The body is of no use to me now, love," Serpendis said. "Just let it go. I'm with you now." Piecora tore herself away from Karui and watched the Scythian assemble a complex instrument that consisted of a long needle attached to a glass cylinder with a metal plunger and a long, slender hose attached to the cylinder. He inserted the needle into Serpendis's wrist, connected it to the first glass vial in the leather wrap through its corked stopper via the slender hose. Then he pulled on the plunger in the back of the glass cylinder, drawing out Serpendis's blood into the hose. The hose went dark with blood and ran from the cylinder to the first glass vial, and as it filled with blood, Piecora noticed that each vial was connected to the next one by a shorter, thinner hose. When the first vial was full, the second one immediately began filling. Shadia then stood up and faced them. "I brought 3 of these blood jackets, each with 3 rows of 12 vials. Hopefully that will be enough," he said. "Well, it'll have to be." "Please tell us why you are doing this," Karui said, "before my friend does something rash." "Of course," he said, "but we need to keep an eye on the transfer. When the first jacket is full, we'll need to quickly switch to the next one." His eyes darted around them nervously, sometimes quickly turning his head and listening for movement within the surrounding mists. "Why are you stealing his blood?" Piecora growled. Shadia rolled his eyes and wiped his forehead with his hand. "I am not stealing his blood. I am transferring it because we need it for—" "Hush! Get down!" They all ducked low to the ground and pressed against the base of the tree, waiting for whatever threat alerted Shadia to emerge. Serpendis strained his awareness to the limits of his allowance between Piecora and Hiero, but then Piecora shifted perception. Hiero took off into the sky, and he found himself riding along through the thick cloud cover above. He could see them huddled together around his body through the haze of the fog from above as Hiero began circling around, reaching further and further outward with each concentric loop and expanding his perimeter of awareness. "See anything?" Piecora asked. "Not yet, but wait, over there. I just heard voices," Serpendis replied. The conversation within Hiero's mind was like one held within a soundproof room, like one of the secret rooms featured within a notable coast haven inn called the Firelight Hour. Aldous Mercado, the innkeeper and ex-adventurer, charged a high price for the use of these rooms. Only once had Serpendis made use of one, of course paid for in full by the client, when he was tasked to present a high-stakes business proposition between a wealthy Enegradan wine merchant and a powerful Dolgitadan noble family. Hiero flew lower through the clouds until the wall surrounding the sanctuary of Shurai emerged. There, at the broken gate where they passed through just the night before, he saw several figures. 3 wore full metal armor of interlocking plates with the same metallic sheen and perceived density as the ruined helmet they found at Piecora's dig site over a week ago. Long silver hair flowed from the base of their helmets over their shoulder pauldrons and down to the middle of their backs. The The fourth figure wore what appeared to be ornate robes, intricately adorned with connecting hexagonal lamellar discs, similar to what Shadia wore as armor, woven into the fabric. Around the floating figure's head sat a plain metal crown with pieces of hexagonal lamellar plates that contoured the sides of the figure's smooth, pale white face. The headpiece seemed to Serpendis to be more practical in function than anything aesthetic or representing status or authority. Like the armored figures, long silver hair flowed down from the metal crown and around her long, straight-pointed ears, over her shoulders, and down to the middle of her back. Then, to Serpendis's astonishment, he noticed the robed figure hovering slightly from the ground, swaying and bobbing gently as the swirling gusts affected her. The drifting mist seemed to bend around an unseen field around her. Each of the armored knights carried a different weapon. One bore a large shield and a long sword, another held a large claymore sword with both hands, and the third held a slightly curved polearm with a nasty hooked blade on one end. The floating figure possessed no physical weapons at all. Unlike Shadia's raiment, the aesthetic of all four figures was plain and featured only the monochromatic tones and shapes that occurred naturally within the metal, fabric, and materials they wore. No colors or embellishments adorned the knight's armor or the floating figure's robes, nor were there any personalized effects, symbols, signs of identification, or tributes, except for the large shield, carried by one of the knights, which bore the motif of the mother tree in plain black enamel over glistening, shining metal. The robes of the floating figure and clothes worn beneath the armor of the knights were solid black. Also, unlike Shadia, these figures were clean and unblemished by age or weather. Their long silver hair gleamed and flowed over their shoulders as if recently washed and combed, and their armor was polished as if it had just recently been exposed to the outside. Here and there throughout the knight's armor were hints and reflections of the surrounding landscape within the thick fog. The robes worn by the floating figure looked as if they were just recently ironed and starched, with meticulously folded creases, and the drapery perfectly layered and hanging without a single wrinkle or unintentional angle. These details alone would have stolen Serpendis's breath away if he was still breathing. They were all female, and they spoke in the ancient Scythian tongue, a language once mythically foreign to Serpendis, but now comprehensible. "If we don't find them by nightfall, we should be on our way," said the tall, floating female Scythian. One of the knights responded with a voice that sounded uncannily similar to the robed figure's voice. Only by the tin acoustics of the metal helm could Serpendis differentiate the two. "Abdicating the search without results, especially within the city's heart, may lead to an exposure we haven't—" "They are inside the sanctuary," the floating figure said, cutting off the armored figure. "They may even be defiling the mother tree right now for all we know. We'll find them before nightfall." "Our overall mission is—" began one of the other knights. "Do you really think I need to be reminded of our mission?" spat the floating figure at the second armored figure. "This takes precedent over the mission, but we only have until nightfall to entertain this deviation. Hopefully, the fugitive doesn't get far before we return to the hunt." "Where do we start with this search for the interlopers?" asked the first armored figure. "We start with the tree, work our way outward to the wall. I know they're here." "I feel their presence," answered the floating figure. "They are coming to the mother tree," shouted Serpendis within Piecora's mind. He transferred his awareness to Piecora, and the group huddled around his corpse. Piecora came back to herself, grabbed Shadia's arm, and repeated Serpendis's claim. "How do you know?" asked Shadia. "I'll explain later," she said. "Where can we hide?" Shadia hopped to his feet, settled into a fighting stance, honed over thousands of years, and drew both swords. "Prepare yourselves, if you can fight," he said. "We must protect the transfer." Venexi, Karui, and Piecora stood around Serpendus's body as the strange bloodletting device did its slow, trickling work. They stared into the surrounding fog around them and waited for the first sign of movement. Just then, a quiet, guttural murmur of monotonal harmonics and clicks and chirps emanated from Kiagri, who now clung to the bark of the mother tree above and behind them. Within the unique Abrignalian sound came the words in Banwarese to everyone's ears: "Remain still. We hide here." Many moments passed of fraught tension as everyone froze in place and stared into the surrounding mist, while Kiagri maintained the song of obfuscation. Then, finally, pulses of white and blue light oscillated deep within the thick bank of fog before them, like a distant storm over the sea. Faint crackling sounds of static discharge came with the erratically pulsating light as it slowly grew near. "Steady," came the words within Kiagri's song. "No moving." Then, gradually, the dark silhouette of the robed figure came into view, floating about 3 meters from the ground. Arcing currents of white and blue electricity weaved and coiled around her floating form as jagged strands of crackling energy ignited the thick atmosphere immediately around her, occasionally bolting further outward in all directions in spasms of slow, scrawling lightning as her powers interacted chaotically with the surrounding moisture-laden cloud. Between her hovering, drifting, soft leather boots and the damp soil beneath was an ever-constant, elongated spark, flickering and dancing within the conduit, connecting her to the wet earth. Then behind and on either side of the floating figure, 3 armored silhouettes took shape within the fog. Their heavy, deliberate footfalls could be heard grinding metallically in the damp soil of the sanctuary. The leading, floating figure bore no open weapons of any kind, but by their formation and the way in which the 3 armored knights regarded the robed figure in front of them, and how they held their distance from her, it seemed that the robed figure was the weapon herself for the others to wield from afar, indicating that the 3 knights were responsible for the hazards her powers posed to everything around them, including themselves. "Halt, adherent 645889, said one of the armored figures, her voice crisp and metallic as it filtered through her helmet. The floating figure had come more into view and stopped her momentum about 30 meters from the tree and from the companions. "That's as near as you're allowed to the tree. Go no further. Begin a sweep around Shirai at your current radius. Report back if you trap anything in your net." "Acknowledged," said the robed figure, her voice clear and calm, identical to the speaking knight's voice except for the tinny metallic alteration created by knight's helmet. A deep, palpable hum increased in volume and physical presence from the floating adherent, as well as the intensity of the strobing, streaking, crackling aura of lightning surrounding her as she turned and drifted slowly to the side, maintaining her distance from the mother tree's base. The 3 armored figures spread further apart and approached the exact place where the companions stood. "Easy, steady, no moving," droned Kiagri slowly while maintaining his hypnotic murmur. Shadia stood furthest out and in front of the companions, and Serpendus watched in horror as the silver-haired Cynthian knights came close enough to feel Shadia's anxious breaths. They even stepped to the side from him on either side, as if unknowingly avoiding his location, then taking several more steps past him. Serpendus couldn't believe it, especially since he had full freedom of movement around the whole situation. The power of Kiagri's drone and that of Abrignalian cloaking left Serpendus aghast as he watched it tested by the worst possible conditions. Eventually, after an excruciating amount of time, the 3 Cynthian knights moved on in the opposite direction from the floating robed figure and disappeared into the surrounding fog as they traversed the base of the mother tree closely. Once again, Piecora sent Hiero to scout above, and Serpendis rode alone with him. Flying beneath the large branches of the tree and near to the tree's kilometers-wide base, they found the armored Scythians on one side and the robed one on the other, about halfway around the tree on either side, when Serpendis came back to Piecora and relayed their positions to her. Of course, Piecora already knew where they were, as she saw through Hiero's gaze. She softly spoke to Shadia, and Shadia relaxed his posture, letting his swords drop to his sides. Noting this, the others did the same, and Kiagri ceased his cloaking murmur. They'll reach the far side of the tree as the sun sets, and if what they say holds, they'll move out of the city, over the heartland, and into the forest during the night, he said, tending to the blood transfer device on Serpendis's body. His eyes fell on Kiagri and said, "You saved us all, my friend. Vioyen, bless your little heart. The greatest powers in the world are nothing when confronted with Abrignalian cloaking." Finally, as the sun began to set on the other side of the sanctuary, the vials in all three blood jackets were full, and Shadia sealed Serpendis's wrist with a tight gauze, after removing the needle and withdrawal device. Serpendis's flesh was now bone white. Piecora was slumped against the tree, watching Shadia pack his gear into the large duffel, while contending with her sadness and confusion. "What now?" Karui asked, standing over Shadia. Shadia rose to meet her eyes while lifting the duffel over his shoulder. "We should bury him here, next to Shurai. He'll provide good nourishment for her." For a while they all dug into the moist earth at the base of the mother tree. Then, at Shadia's command, they gently lifted Serpendis's body and laid him into the grave. Shadia and Venexi pushed the dirt back over the body, while Piecora stared in silence. Karui stood with her arm around her friend. "Say something before we leave?" asked Karui. Piecora thought for long moments, while Shadia expertly flattened the soil over the grave, as if he had done so thousands of times before. Soon it was as if nothing was ever there. She then knelt and pushed a single Scythian coin into the soil, then covered it. Rising, she said, "He was an old fealty. We hated each other when we met, and I only agreed to help him selfishly. But in the end, he became like family to me. Eventually, I wanted more than anything to return him to his home, regardless of payment. Funny, the one job I wanted to do for free was the one I failed at. Goodbye, you old bricklayer." Serpendis felt a swelling of sentimentality rise within his awareness at the sound of her words, but only distantly. He felt the need to say something to Piecora, but struggled for the right words. Finally, he said within her mind, "You did not fail. I did. This is all my fault." "Yes, yes, it is," she replied, "but that does not change my purpose. I will still get you home, where you belong, when this is all over." Quietly, the company walked away from the base of the tree and crossed the wide-open sanctuary promenade back to the broken gate where they came from. Once again, they stood on etched, crystalline pavement. "We're not out of danger yet," said Shadia, eyeing the avenues and alleys of the city before them. "Night is coming, and we must leave the city as quickly as possible." They left the perimeter of the promenade and made their way through the crystalline city of Aeonwyrm, much differently than previous days before Shadia joined their company. Whereas before they walked openly through the rain and clouds in awe of their surroundings, now they moved silently in the darkness, following Shadia as he stopped and checked every corner, flattening himself against every gem structure and spire, then sometimes sprinting across open market areas as the need arose. Nothing seemed to change about the city for Piecora, Venexi, Karui, Serpendis, and Kiagri. But now they each felt a hanging presence of dread, as if their breathing might elicit an alarm or attack from some unseen enemy. As the dawn approached, Shadia finally stopped and led them into a gem structure of fractalized, translucent amethyst, quartz, and opaque jade. The interior reminded Serpentis of the camp at the Pool of Vioyen, with piles of stores and supplies stacked against the sides of the structure and bedding throughout the upper floors, as if many Cynthians were expected to rest here. They were exhausted from the traveling and events of the previous night and day. Piecora spoke to no one as she went upstairs and flopped onto one of the cots without even removing her stag antlers. Hero flew in and found a niche beneath her arm, and the two fell fast asleep. Serpentis did not feel fatigue, so he flowed his awareness down and observed the others. Vinexi did the same as Piecora and fell asleep in another bed. Kiagri climbed onto one of the timber rafters of the gem and slept with one leg dangling down over the bottom floor, purring softly. Karui and Shadia remained awake, and the two sat together at a wooden table with a single floating mote of dim light hovering in the air between them. Serpentis sensed that they were both fatigued, but not yet ready for sleep. "Where are you taking us?" asked Karui. Shadia leaned back in his chair, set his swords onto the table, loosened several knots of his armor, and craned his neck from side to side for comfort. Serpentis wondered how many days, or even weeks, or months, or even years he had been wearing it. "Losh Anam Rioth is our destination," he answered tiredly. "The Lake of Frozen Time," said Karui. "We've been there already." "It's hard to miss," he said. "Did anything happen?" "Oh, much," she answered. "We all felt something watching us, and our elderly merchant friend had a vision of the kindred war when he looked into the water." "Too much for a mortal," Shadia said, shaking his head. "This whole place, it's not meant for mortals. Cynthia is ill-equipped to provide the tender care that they need. It's simply too much. It overripens them, like fruit sitting in the sun. No mortal has ever passed through Kiahalla, not even the Hyalangorn during the kindred war. They came close to Cynthia. Oh, yes. But then, Vioyen—" He made a gesture with his arm, straightening it in front of him. "She wiped them all out. That was the last time any mortal breached the encircling forest and came close to Cynthia, save only one man until now. Only one man has ever seen the city, stood within its halls, entered the very heart itself, and touched the mother tree until now. But unlike your merchant friend, Belial survived, by her grace." "You speak of Belial, last of the Hyalangorn. It is said he was granted immortality so long as he remained in Cynthia. What has happened to him since your troubles of late?" Karui asked. "Troubles," he replied, snickering. "Yes, if you consider the near eradication of the Eldar through their own civil war, I'd wager that would be troublesome, to say the least. Isn't that the justice we deserve, though? The fates are fickle, but they are never wrong. Belial, oh, he still lingers in Cynthia. The power of these lands keeps him alive by the grace of Vioyen, though he's lost much of his mind by now. Since the fall of Aeonwyrm, we hid him in a place I cannot divulge, not here, but we protect him and keep him safe by Vioyen's decree and her grace." They sat for a moment in silence. Then Karui said, "We met someone at the lake, a maiden of the Fae, old and powerful. She called herself the Morrigan. She gave us 3 riddles to answer. We answered each one correctly, thanks mostly to Serpentis and that calculating mind of his. Then she descended into the lake. Alachai Lathmalan says she and Bagayan Crimaran are one and the same. Is this true?" "You've met the hermit?" asked Shadia in surprise. "When?" Karui looked puzzled. "The morning that we learned Serpentis had died, he appeared to us. It was he who transferred Serpentis's soul into Bogea's tooth." Then he disappeared just as you came to us from the mists." "I had no idea," Shadia said, visibly perplexed. Taking matters into his own hands for once, it seems. He works through many levels of engagement, and so his influence is never obvious despite his precise manipulations. For him to make direct contact with you means we have his full attention, which means things are either going very right or very wrong. As to your question, he continued, yes, Bogean Cremaran has many forms. The Morrigan is one of them. Sometimes she is also the Maran, Mary, Morian, Mariah, many others. He was different than I had expected, Karui said. The hermit, I mean, Alakai. Yes, I imagine so, Shadia said. The Scythians call him Dethrialbnach, which does not mean hermit like the Xianyan name Tukurai. Rather, it means deceiver. He has lived long beyond his mortal years, Karui said. I wonder how such longevity would affect a mortal mind. If you live knowing you will die one day, even if never coming to harm, if you live knowing that you are meant to die, that the one day of your expiration lies ahead of you, and you cannot avoid it, then how does one fare when they prolong this truth for as long as he has, or escape it altogether? I'd imagine it would drive one mad, said Shadia. Mortals are mortal because that is simply what they are. It is how they were made. It affects everything they do and how they see every single moment in their lives. Elves have long lives but are still mortal. They may live for centuries if they wish to do so. But eventually they grow tired of living, and their souls pass on. Scythians are immortal, as children of Vioyen and Avanom. We do not age. Even the passing of an elf's entire lifetime is but a single day for us. Thus, we see things very differently from mortals. Our entire society is different from mortal society, even when it comes to managing our population. We do not feel the rush of time, the urgency of achievement, or the sense that our purpose, our destiny, is limited by time, except when it is imposed on us by external influences. For a mortal to realize freedom from the limitation of time, to see the world the way we do, and live beyond what they are capable of, it would certainly drive them mad, to say the least, I would think. Deep inside, I believe they would suffer under the expectation of death, even if they learned how to avoid it. Death is part of who they are. It defines them. It is what it means to be mortal and foundational to their understanding of who and what they are. To live in constant expectation of that elusive eventuality would feel like holding one's breath for eternity. The yearning for release would be endless, relentless, irreconcilable torture. Yet for the one without the need to breathe, the requirement never enters their mind. So they never miss it. You cannot be free from something you never had to begin with. Over the following week, the company quietly and cautiously threaded their way through the cloud-enshrouded, labyrinthian gemstone city of Aeonwyrm, the city of immortals, now empty of all life save for the mother tree at its heart and the many different birds that lived and died for countless generations within the tree and the high-altitude weather surrounding it. They only traveled at night and never spoke openly except when resting inside the city's gem structures. Eventually, Shadia led them to another elevator. This one was smaller and set within the base of a tall spire of translucent ruby and opaque bloodstone. They descended through the Hill of Gorai within the crystal elevator, passing caverns of waterfalls and forests of lichen, molds and brightly colored fungal structures and complex networks of mycelial capillaries and synapses, stretched roots and nerves that connected everything beneath the city since its creation in the beginning of recorded time. The crystal elevator final came to a stop at the ground level of the Scythian heartland, inside a small cave filled with supplies and bedding similar to other Iadzi camps. They spent the night there, and the next morning, after eating breakfast and restocking their supplies, the company of Piecora, Karui, Vinexi, and Kirgri headed out into the Heartland, led by Shadia Lom Shurvanga, the illuminated scholar and arch-sage of the Pinnacle in the Court of Willows, and surviving member of Yadsi Damhai, Reanmha Gusroilhe, those who live and fight, and Ahndiarma, Ditha the Forgotten. They travelled by day now and rested at night beneath the open sky. Although Shadia still worried about being discovered by his enemies, he seemed less bothered than when they were inside the city. They were too exposed in the Heartland. But this also meant they could see their enemies coming from a long way off. The Heartland has remained a place of tenuous peace since the fall, he said one night, beneath the three-quarter white moon high in the sky, and a creeping sliver of the red moon low over the horizon. It's too open out here, too vast. You won't find our enemies in the Heartland. They are just as exposed as we are, but when inside the city or the forest, one must be careful. What is this enemy? Asked Karui. Remnants from the war to some extent, skirmishes here and there between survivors and Unmora's agents. But lately, perhaps over the last few hundred years, the skirmishes have subsided further as our numbers dwindled, Shadia replied. It's a relatively quiet time now. I believe there's been a change in philosophy. It's possible that the Iadsi are too few to be worth hunting anymore, or that it's become too wasteful on resources to chase each last one of us. For my part, I haven't seen another Scythian in many years. We used to leave each other messages, and we agreed that our isolation worked in our favor, so we never gathered in strength or pooled our numbers together. However, the last message I found was years ago, so I fear for the worst at this point. Why not seek help from the outside if things are this dire? Karui asked. The Banwar, at least, would have come. Several reasons, Shadia began, but the primary reason is the doubled-edged practicality of Kiahalla. Even though we have the help of Bogian Cremaran and the Fae that live there, the encircling forest is too dangerous to invite anyone through. We cannot control the forest, and neither can Bogian Cremaran. Thus, we are imprisoned by the very barrier that protected us in the beginning. We will never ask anyone from the outside, including our neighbors and kin, the Banwar, to suffer the forest's unbiased purpose to slay and repel any intruders. If it held off the Norolth in the beginning days when Avanom first awoke, when the forest was young, it could certainly destroy anything else, especially now. It has only gotten older, stronger, and crueler with age. Same with its denizens, many of which have become twisted, corrupt, even vile. So what is this? Unmora? Piecora asked. Unmora is one of us, a Scythian, and a sorceress with power this world has never witnessed before. But where is she? Where are the others? Where is the other half of Cynthia? Karui asked. If Cynthia fell to civil war, where are the victors? These lands look like remnants from a plague or an invasion. You are the first and only Scythian that we have met since we came to the Fey realm. Did they all go to the primal realm? The Fey realm and primal realm are one and the same, but only here in Cynthia, Shadia said. There is no separation between the two here in the Heartland, nor in Avanyamon. Only within the encircling forest do the worlds of reality begin to shear, fade, and split between the Fey and primal realms, like a tattered veil that blows constantly in the wind. And this is another reason why the forest is so treacherous. It is riddled with holes and rifts between worlds, and then there is the mist each morning that bleeds directly from the mistlands where one can become trapped and lost forever. Only outside of Kiahalla is there clear delineation between the worlds of the Fey and the primal. Then where is Unmora now? Asked Vinexi. "What I say next must be spoken quietly and cannot be uttered without discretion," Shadia said, in a soft, dark tone. Everyone leaned closer to him so they could hear. "Unmora is the dark sorceress and plague of our land. Her heart is black, and her spirit is beyond redemption. Her mind is brilliant beyond any Eldar before or since. She has discovered ways to even cheat the fates. She alone destroyed all of Cynthia and left it in the ruins that it is today. During the war that we call the Calamity, we realized too late that there was no chance of defeating her. Our civil war began shortly after the Kindred War ended in the genocide of the Humankind, perhaps by about several hundred years, and the initial major fighting was swift. Soon after, those who survived among the dwindling survivors became the Iadsi Damhai Reanmha Gushoile, those who live and fight, and Andiama Diethiae, the Forgotten. The war changed into isolated skirmishes throughout the Heartland as the city became deserted. Slowly, we were pushed against the encircling forest. By then, our numbers had fallen drastically, and the few of us remaining finally fled separately into treacherous Kiahalla, completely cut off from each other. Unmora's agents continued hunting us for a while, further depleting us, but they also suffered from the forest as we did. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, then continued. At some point, we realized that Unmora's agents were no longer hunting us, but were entering the forest for different reasons. We learned that prisoners were escaping Fornia the Gal, the fortress of vapors, that Unmora had built within the Mistlands before the war, and from where she rules. These prisoners would flee into the forest from agents of Unmora specifically trained for their capture, called adherents and retrievers. That's who we met in the city the night I joined your company, when your friend died. He sat silent for another moment, taking a long draught of water from his cup. That is where we are today, at least from my understanding. I have not seen another fellow Yadsi for a long while. I roam the encircling forest from camp to camp, hunting agents of Unmora. I have never met a living prisoner. Either they are captured and brought back to Fornia the Gal, or slain by the forest or one of its denizens. And for any that do actually survive, they suffer Kiahalla's final and most lasting evil peril, forgetfulness. Anyone who leaves the outer perimeter of the encircling forest faces the outside world as if they have just discovered themselves for the first time, and only hints and broken fragments of their memories remain. It is the harshest and cruelest of the forest's defenses, as it is unbiased and affects us all, making Cynthians its prisoners. This is just one more reason why we did not send for help from the outside. He stretched, signed, and then went on with his tale. I receive aid from the Fae and blessings from Bogey and Cremaran from time to time. I've learned enough about the abilities and tactics of Unmora's agents to dispatch them if I'm able to isolate them, but even fighting them alone is perilous. Shadia paused again, lost in memories of hard-fought battles and fallen kin. After a short while, Karui broke into his reverie. Regarding this forgetfulness imposed by the encircling forest, it is said that the Eldar left Kiahalla and hunted the remaining Humankind all the way to their homes in the foothills, and they slew all that remained of the Humankind before returning to... They never returned, Shadia corrected her. I've heard several versions of this mythology, and they are all wrong. Trust me, I was there at the time. The truth is, the Eldar force that Vioyen ordered to leave Cynthia and chase down the remaining Humankind threat never returned. And this is another grief in a mountain of sorrows that contributed to Vioyen's slumber to this very day. Not only did her decision, made in the madness of the moment, to send forth the Eldar to destroy the invading Humankind enemies lead to the eradication of the entire Humankind people, but it came at such irreconcilable cost. She lost the entire force as they each fell under the spell of forgetfulness when they broke from the tree line. In the emptiness left behind by their dissipated memories and identities came the inexplicable flood of misunderstood rage and bloodlust. Looking to each other only validated and heightened their battle frenzy as they all suffered the same affliction in equal measure without comprehension. Thus the entire force rampaged across the fields of Undying in singular, witless, hate-fueled purpose toward the Hyalangorn villages in the northern foothills and mountains, where the families of the Hyalangorn fallen awaited the return of their loved ones. Of all the misfortune, all of the bloodshed, and the consequences that came after, the fall of the Hyalangorn, in this fashion, is the greatest of the sins our mother can never forgive herself of, he concluded. The companions sat around the fire beneath the stars for a long while without speaking. Crickets chirped around them, and occasionally a bat flew overhead. A snake slithered across the camp at one point, but no one took notice except for Hero, who mentally tagged it as food for later. Serpendus's awareness sat with them also, thinking of a long Dolgithadan pipe stuffed with Enigradin Soliandrum leaf. Everything that Shadia spoke of was known to him, thanks now to his proximity with Bogian Cremaran's memories, but he found them extremely difficult to articulate, especially using his own native Canonian words. Piecora then spoke. "What do we have to do with any of this?" she asked hopelessly, kicking a log into the fire. Sparks erupted into the night sky, and a wave of heat blew in Shadia's direction. "None of us are warriors, soldiers, magi, or druids, or dragons, or Eldar, or equipped at all for dealing with what you are describing. I pity your people and your plight, I really do. But if you are looking for help from us, you are sorely misguided. We only want to get back home to our world and see familiar faces again. We've already lost one that was dear to us, an old man who only thought of his wealth and his next meal. Now you are leading us into the teeth of some doom that none of us could possibly survive. Your hermit says you are the key, and you have everything we need to change the course of this history and save our people," Shadia replied. "You mean the Deceiver," Karui said, "as the Scythians name him." "Yes," Shadia said, locking eyes with Karui intently over the campfire. "I do not trust the hermit, but I trust Bogian Cremaran. The hermit has his own shrouded agenda, like with all things, but Bogia cares for us, and—" "Then why didn't she act? Back then, when you needed her most?" Piecora shouted, shattering the night's peaceful quiet. She bolted up to her feet and glowered at Shadia. Serpendus recognized that face, withering in the liquid haze and rising sparks of the fire like some ethereal demon from the abyss. "Where was your dragon queen, or whatever she calls herself, when it all happened? Where was your dragon queen when your city fell, when it all went to Shiendi? Stag, where is she now? Why does she not go and destroy this horrible sorceress even now? If she is so ancient and so powerful, why in all of the hells does this fall on us, and she does nothing?" Shadia lowered his eyes to the fire and stared distantly into the flames. "Bogian Cremaran is sworn to protect all Eldar. Thus she is bound by her oath to not challenge Anmora or harm any Scythian, regardless of their allegiance. For this, she mourns for all of us, even Anmora. But there is something else. After the Kindred War, but just before the calamity, Bogian Cremaran departed from the forest for a short while. It was the only time she had ever done so. No one knows where she went, and she never speaks of it. But when she returned, Cynthia was inflamed in civil war, and some blamed her absence for it. Countless piles of dead littered the heartland, and Aeonwyrm was abandoned. I believe she has never forgiven herself, and why she has obsessed over devising this plan, even to the extent of this alliance with the hermit. the deceiver. She, like all Yadsi, wishes to heal Cynthia, to see us thriving once again. This means Unmora must be destroyed, but she cannot challenge Unmora directly. She needs others. That does not answer the question of why we are even remotely involved in this. We are not fighters. If Unmora could destroy Cynthia, what makes you think? Because, as I said before, your hermit says you are the key to enacting this plan, that you have what Bogian Crimaran needs, Shadia replied. I have no other answers for you. I don't know what any of it means. I was merely sent to retrieve you and bring you to her. I think we will all find our answers there. To the lake? Asked Karui. Yes, to the lake, said Shadia. Losh Anham Reotha, the lake of frozen time. It is also called Baal Enataya Na Hygroishta, lair of the infinity serpent. It is the home of Bogian Cremaran, the Aeonwyrm. So you are telling us, Piecora said, her voice rising, that we must bargain with not only a dragon, which according to children's tales can never be trusted, but also with Tukurai, one of the three hierophants that the Scythians call the Deceiver, who also can never be trusted, that we must destroy this ancient evil that plunged your country into ruin, reconcile the sins of an absent mother who sleeps in a tree all day and all night because she can't get over herself, and usher in a new peace and prosperity for Cynthia, home of the immortal Eldar and the Undying Lands, in order for us to get back home so I can finally enjoy one Fielkung crusty mug of hot Sienyan cider. Then she shouted, before anyone could answer, Spirits, stag on a stick! That is some horse shendy! Horse shendy! She shouted, then spat into the fire. None of this is our problem. I'll sooner try my luck at the first pond and see where that leads than take part in this comedy of yours. The group sat stunned around the fire, watching her without knowing what to say. But then she heard a voice in her mind. Old girl, this is the only way home. You know it and— said Serpendus. To hell's with you, you old sot! You took the easy way out of this tale, she shouted aloud, tearing the knife from its sheath and throwing it into the fire. She then stormed off into the night, with Hero zipping past her shoulder from where he was hiding in the grass. It was Vinexi who thrust his hand into the flames and retrieved the knife. Shadia said quietly, All is lost, then, if we don't bring her back. But I fear I will only push her further away. She is afraid, Karui said. This is what she does when it gets too much for her. This is all too much, even for me. Not for me, said Vinexi. How can you say that? How does an elf, long-lived and kindred to demigods, not see as far as I do? I would never have left the district if I had the same limited sight as you. I would never have courted an Ostanidian princess if I thought as little of myself as you. He stood to his feet and raised his voice. The world is bigger than all of us, and not until recently were you actually confronted with that, apparently. We are all part of this, whether you like it or not. Gone are the days when only your next meal and whatever you painted on your face mattered to you. We all are, and we always have been, part of something bigger. I learned that as a boy, the moment I made eye contact with another child. We are connected. We are in this together, no matter how you feel about it. Life comes at you from every angle and every moment of your life. To truly live life is to glimpse these revelations and seize them as your own, because they are yours already. He called out to Piecora, If you haven't noticed, this is very much your problem. Crying about it doesn't change anything. All you care about is going home. Where is home? For any of us? What good is a home when you can't even live your life where you stand, where you're needed, when others depend on you? Why bother with home when nothing else matters to you? Or have you forgotten how to cherish each moment of your life during the brief time you get to live it? He tossed the knife at her feet, and the blade sunk into the soil. Then he looked down at Shadia and said, "I miss my Alice with all of my heart, and you have no idea who that is. I need to find her, just to know if she's alive or dead. And who knows, maybe one day that becomes your problem, like yours is mine right now. Either way, I accept my part in this tale. I will help the people of Cynthia with whatever I have to offer, and I can only hope that the fates will lead me to my Alice in ways I cannot yet fathom." Vinexi stood over the fire before them as a lord of Nalupizausu of old, before Maunidaneim Elugi, the mingling of humans and devils, before Pidzausu Portiraka, the war of devils and dragons, before the ritual of Sunyakari Aripala, the sorceress summoner Tiafuan, and the cataclysm that destroyed the southern part of the continent, and the creation of Muth, before his people were hunted, subjugated, and quarantined within Eindungzirk, Unscavian district of Norschland. Piecora slowly came back to the fire, holding Serpendis, Tooth of Bogea, in her hands. "There is something to that lad," Serpendis said within her mind. "Fiery blood in him, noble blood. He is more than he appears, and that's not including his handshake with the beast beneath the salt sea." "Yes, I think you're right," she replied quietly, aloud to the knife. Then she looked up at Vinexi. "Your words burned inside me, and in all of us, I think," she said. "You're a complicated person, Vinexi. I think I shall never understand you. But thank you for bringing me back to who I am. I could have never left Muth with Alice and endured the voyage across the salt sea if I thought any less of this life," he replied, his voice softening. "I know you see it this way too. Your patrons place their very survival in your hands when you guide them across the wildlands, and this came after you and Hero discovered each other, and after your homeland rejected you. That is when you found purpose. That is how I think we can understand each other." He looked around at the whole group and said, "We are all wanderers, survivors, lost, but not directionless. This is what the hermit must see in us, I would guess. We are like the alignment of the moons for him. Our coming together is what he was waiting for." Piecora looked at Shadia and said softly while shaking her head, "I still wonder how a wanderer of the wildlands, a nomadic shaman, a street urchin, and Kiagri, who is probably most qualified of all of us to be here, can have any effect, any contribution, any value at all at helping your people." "I wonder that as well, Sienyan," Shadia said. "But my trust is in Bogian Cremaran, not the hermit, and I would caution anyone who is so readily afflicted by his tongue. Bogea studied each of you. She even presented herself to you, and you won her favor. She believes in you, and I must get you to her safely." Days turned into weeks as the company traveled over hills and fields, farms and streams, until once again they found themselves at the forest's inner edge. Shadia plunged right in without turning back, and the others hurried to keep up, despite their apprehension. More days followed as Shadia led the company efficiently and quickly through the forest. The journey felt easier and more intentional than before, thanks to Shadia's guidance and placement of the Iadsi camps. Like Piecora with the wildlands, Shadia had come to know the encircling forest better than any other place he had ever lived. Over the long years of his life since the fall of Aeonwyrm, Kiahalla became his home. For several weeks they traveled camp to camp, resting and resupplying as they went. Every time Shadia noted that there were no messages, nor any signs that others had been there, and his mood grew increasingly sullen with each disappointment. Finally, after over a month since leaving the Heartland, the company stood over a windy, sun-drenched bluff overlooking the Lake of Frozen Time. A promontory of large boulders and overgrown exposed granite and limestone were shaped into paths and benches many ages ago that surrounded a large inlet within the vast lake. An ancient oak tree, one of the largest and oldest that Serpentis had ever seen in Kiahalla, grew from between several massive boulders on the edge of the lake, and a colossal bough, roughly 5 meters thick, grew from its side and over the inlet. A short curtain of crystals and gems hung from the giant branch directly over the inlet, blowing and clinking like wind chimes in the lake breeze. Serpentis imagined, through Bugea's influence, the place teeming with Cynthian commoners and onlookers seated around the inlet on stone benches, and a parade of Cynthian lords slowly descending one of the many stone paths of the quay. Fires were lit in large copper braziers shapes in the coils of a serpent, now long gone, as floating motes of light hovered over everyone's heads and over the inlet. "Nobility came to this place with much ceremony," said Serpentis quietly in Piecora's mind. She looked at Shadia and said, "Is this the way to her lair?" "It is," he said, his eyes seeing far into his past. Then he looked at her and said, "I've used it before, long ago when times were different." He descended the stairs and fluidly made his way between the boulders and outcroppings, now broken and overgrown, cracked and shattered with age. The group followed him until they reached the very bottom of the ruined arena and stood at the stony edge of the bay. The sun reached toward its zenith high overhead and felt warm on their faces and skin. A cool breeze blew over the dark blue ripples of the lake. Many small birds flew above their heads and along the shoreline within the trees. Looking across the lake at the far distant shores, Serpentis tried to determine where they were when they first discovered the lake, when he received his terrifying vision, but without luck. Suddenly, rising up from the inlet and breaking the surface of the water, came a large, smooth, transparent crystal-like glass, quartz, or diamond, or an amalgam of all three. Serpentis imagined it was about as large as 2 Coast Haven taxi wagons held together side by side. It stopped when the waterline reached midway along the lateral axis of the gigantic crystal. Bright sunlight refracted through the gem in dazzling shapes of rainbow hues that caused them all to squint and hold their hands over their eyes. Inside the transparent gem, on the recessed, rounded floor beneath the waterline, were old blankets and pillows, several large sacks and barrels, and a short, wooden meditation desk. Shadia placed his hand onto the side of the gem, and a large circular opening appeared just above the water. He held out his hand to the others and smiled warmly. "Come, it's a long ride down, but a comfortable one," he said. Everyone looked around apprehensively, as if trying to memorize their final glimpse of the surface one last time. "Come on, dear love," Serpentis said. "What stories we'll have to share back home." Karui entered the crystalline submersible lake craft, first with Kiegri on her shoulders, followed by Vinexi. Shadia looked at Piecora and held out his hand. She saw her friends inside the gem getting settled into the soft blankets. Then she looked up at Hero, who stood perched on the giant overhanging bough, looking down at the craft with his head pitching from side to side in curiosity. The air shimmered between the curtain of crystal wind chimes hanging from the large branch looming over the inlet, and the top of the gem craft producing a barely perceptible, muted, deep, quivering sound. "I'm terrified," she said finally. "I'm used to wide-open spaces. This is—" She wrung her hands and began hyperventilating. Shadia held a thin strip of layered leaves and ointment close to her mouth as she struggled to control her breathing. It had a strong, mint-like odor. "Here, child, lift your tongue. Hold this there in your mouth. Let it dissolve. It will heal your anxiety," he said. She took the small leaf salve and did as he advised, and soon her breathing evened out. "There's more inside the craft if you feel ill or become afraid." There's also a stash of what is left from our finest wine. Food as well, he said with a glint in his eye. Serpendis realized Shadia was very much enjoying this moment. She looked up at Hero, and he flew down to her shoulder, and slowly they entered the crystalline submersible lake craft. It gently bobbed and swayed from her added weight, and she quickly moved to the back near the small desk and sat down. Hero hopped off and perched onto the desk, flicking his head all around nervously. They sat beneath the waterline and were surrounded by the lake's upper shallows, where sunlight streamed down in straight beams of drifting, flickering light. Small schools of fish swam here and there through the sunlight, as well as the occasional turtle and snake. All around were the sounds of the water lapping against the crystalline side of the transparent craft, and there was a faint, musty odor within the capsule that reminded Serpendis of damp cloth and the threat of rain. Shadia finally entered the craft, touched the side next to the opening, and with a dull thunk, the crystalline lake craft sealed closed. "Is everyone comfortable?" he asked, situating himself in the middle of the craft. He placed his palm against the ceiling while standing, and the craft gently began descending beneath the water. Piecora looked up and saw the overhanging giant oak, the cerulean blue skies of the Fey realm, and all else of the surface world that was familiar to her, slowly ripple and fade beneath the trickling water's edge as it encompassed the entirety of the crystalline capsule. Down they went into the darkness of the deep lake. As the light began to fade within the craft, Shadia released a glowing mote above his head, just beneath the ceiling. For long moments it was quiet inside the crystalline craft, save for everyone's excitable breathing and Venexi's occasional cough and sneeze. Kiagri leapt from Karui and stuck onto the crystalline curved side, staring out into the lake's depths. Serpendis recalled this same view when they saved Venexi and watched the dead water horse fall into the fathomless darkness below. Never could he have imagined that he would return and descend into these very same depths. The temperature began to fall gradually inside the crystal as their surroundings grew steadily darker. Finally, Karui turned around, leaned against the front curvature of the craft, gathered her knees up, and pulled a soft blanket over her bare, violet-patterned legs. She said to Shadia, How is all of this possible?" Shadia sat down and said, "It is called a flomhia croistail, or flom, a crystal submersion craft. It was built during the peak of Cynthian abundance and prosperity long before the Kindred War. As to how it works, it uses the same principles as all other Cynthian technology: color, light, sound, and frequency. We harness these things, as well as the natural forces and elements of the world, with gems, crystals, minerals, liquids, something to do with their internal structures, manipulating lattices and whatnot. I never understood any of it even in my youth, as I'm not gifted with such a mind, so unfortunately I cannot be trusted to teach any of it to you. But as a chronicler, I wrote countless texts, guides, manuals, and materials for others to use for learning and advancing their expertise. Always guided by an expert looking over my shoulder, I never knew what I was writing, but I was good at explaining it. The world outside of Kiahalla thinks many things about the Cynthians according to the limits of their imaginations," said Karui in awe. "But no dream, no concocted mythology can come close to the reality we have witnessed. Cynthia is so much more than anyone can possibly understand on their own." Shadia looked down, and a deep sorrow shadowed his face. "And think of what you've missed. You've come during our downfall," he said. "All you have seen are ghostly remnants of the past, and ruins of our society long buried beneath the hills of the Heartland. Imagine what it was like in my day. Imagine the sky filled with ships of the air, pulled by great birds that are long extinct. Imagine crystalline canals and aqueducts flowing across the heartland, farms and villages, towns and markets, carnivals and places of recreation, all surrounding the hill of Gorai with brightly colored banners and kites and heated balloons rising high into the air. Imagine the deafening sounds of the heartlands as our people chanted as one with joy during the annual celebration of Vioyen's coming into the world. Imagine such a time of peace and love and unlimited horizons of opportunity, ingenuity, art and music, food, and... He trailed off and held his hand to his face, rubbing his tired eyes. "You kept it all to yourselves," Karui said quietly, and turned her head to the side to stare into the vast, deep, indigo darkness of the lake's middle depths. No one spoke afterward, and gradually everyone fell asleep as the Florm continued its gentle downward voyage into the deepest fathoms of the lake. Piecora roused from her deep sleep and was at first confused by her surroundings. Karui had come to lay next to her, and Kiagri laid nestled by Karui's head. Venexi slept alone where he sat after entering the Florm. Before her rested a plate of food consisting of grapes, berries, cooked fish, cheese, and bread. She found similar plates next to the others. Shadia was busy rummaging through the stores near where Venexi still slept. When he turned, he held a glass bottle in one hand and several crystal glasses in the other. He lifted his finger, holding the glasses to his lips, for Piecora to stay silent. Quietly, he crept over the blankets and knelt in front of her. "I promise you," he whispered, "you have never had wine like year 1735-242, Sposra am Brableth, Marigold Emberstalk, from the Second Age, the time of quiet. It's a special occasion. This is the good stuff. My own stash." He uncorked the bottle with a muted thoop sound, using a small, strange metal device that featured two swing arms, a coiled pin to pierce the cork with, and a ring to straddle the bottle's neck. He then poured some of its contents into the glass and handed it to Piecora. "Do you smell that?" He sighed with intense satisfaction, the bouquet of complex, intermingling scents as they touched the air for the first time in over 1,000,000 years. "It brings me right back to my study at the top of the pinnacle in the Court of Willows." "Over 1,000,000 years? Really?" asked Piecora groggily while taking the crystal goblet. "Is it even drinkable?" Shadia took a sip from her glass, and his face melted into sleepy ecstasy. "Oh, yes, it is drinkable. Savor it," he said. "What is the occasion, actually?" she asked, sitting up and tasting the wine. Indeed, it was nothing like she had ever tasted before. Swishing the sip around in her mouth, the flavor tasted of bitter ginger, citrus, and white grape, followed by an organic warmth that soothed the palate. It wasn't terrible, but she preferred warmed Siennian cider, found in most taverns in her homeland. He poured himself a glass and said, "You are the first people that I have met in a very long time. Let us not forget the basic needs of social interaction while we are on this mission. Be without it for overlong, and you begin to question your own purpose, your own worth, and in the case of our first meeting, my social graces. I might be the last living Cynthian for all I know, but now I sit with friends from the outside as we travel to Bogyan-Claimaran. This is a good occasion, one that I could not foresee merely months ago. I feel hopeful again. Why not enjoy our lives while we are living them?" She raised her glass to that in Canonian fashion, then took another sip of the Cynthian wine. The others awoke eventually and partook of the wine and full plates of food. They ate until they were full, as there was plenty of food among the stores. Even Hero had his share of meat and berries from Piecora's plate. All around them was total darkness, except for the small light at the ceiling of the craft, Nothing could be seen from the outside, not even by Karui's elven night vision. "How far have we come?" asked Karui. "We passed beyond the middle depths a few hours ago while you slept," Shadia replied. "Now we are in the lower depths and the darkness. We may see some strange creatures down here if we're lucky." "Lucky?" Karui asked. "Are you not afraid?" "I've made this trip over a dozen times. Things may be curious of us. We're the only light down here except for what they produce themselves. They may come near the flame, they may even nudge it a little. But we are safe. We are protected by Bogean Cremaran's influence." "Ask if we are deeper than the salt sea," Sependis asked Piecora in her mind. "I'm curious about that." "Are we further down than even the salt sea?" she asked. "Loche Anam Rio itself is not as deep as the salt sea, I don't believe," Shadia said. "I wouldn't know, as I've never been to the bottom of the salt sea. But this I do know, this lake actually has no bottom. It passes right through to the plane of water, and that is where Bogean Cremaran lives." The companions all stared at Shadia in fear and shock. Shadia chuckled. "I assure you, we will be fine. We are in Bogean Cremaran's protection now. The flame takes us right into her chamber. There is nothing to fear. I have made this trip many times." As he said this, a huge sphere, twice the size of the flame, came into view behind Shadia, lit by the tiny light mote inside the craft. The sphere was a yellowish outer layer with a soft white inner layer, and a black pinpoint was at the center of the white interior. Then the rest of the shape loomed over the craft, white with blood-red patches, and it became apparent that the sphere was a single eye, one of many others that investigated the flame. Long, bright crimson tentacles, as wide as Coast Haven streets, coiled and swayed around the flame. Each tentacle had white suckers half the size of the crystalline submersible capsule. The companions all reacted in terror and pointed in every direction around them. Venexi writhed and coiled into a ball, repeating the name Ichthyophaloxu. No one could possibly guess at the total size or shape of the monstrosity visiting them. Shadia whirled around and froze at the sight of the massive creature, his hand shaking and spilling his wine. Suckers moved along the sides of the crystalline craft, making sickening, muffled, rubbing and squeaking sounds that reverberated all around inside the craft. More tentacles wrapped around the capsule on the other side, roughly shoving and jolting the flame here and there. Finally, after what seemed like entire minutes of torturous, helpless doom, the thing vanished into the darkness in an instant, and the pressurized vacuum in its wake momentarily sucked the craft behind it, before the craft snapped back into its original column of intentional descent. "Gods," murmured Sependis within Piecora's mind. "I'd have pissed myself right in the blankets if I still had a body. That I know." Piecora's back was pressed against the curved side, her antlers askew on her head and several upturned plates on top of her. No one moved for several minutes, each looking in different directions, frozen in fear. Finally, Shadia stood up and stretched his arms over his head and said, "Well, that was something I'd never seen before. I'll admit I was scared witless." Those things live in the lake?" asked Karui, her voice trembling. "I am not sure, to be honest," said Shadia. "I've written about Loch Anam Rioth many times from experts who know everything that lives in here, and not one of them have described an entity as we just encountered." "You said the lake has no bottom," said Karui, "that it descends into—" Her voice trailed off as she drifted back into shock. "The plane of water," said Shadia. "Imagine an entire world like the primal world, only it is filled with water. It lies far beneath the surface of the primal world, beneath the plane of earth. Loch Anam Rioth cuts right through the plane of earth and connects directly with the plane of water." "Maybe." That was, Karui stammered. She couldn't believe what she was thinking, saying, or experiencing, even as an elven shaman who knew many wondrous and strange things that were beyond the comprehension of most mortal people. "A creature from another plane, yes, it must have been," said Shadia. "Something entered our world directly from the plane of water, I think. Or we left our world already, and that thing is one of the locals in this other realm where Bagia lives," asked Piecora, finally sitting up and clearing the plates off her. "That could be true as well," Shadia said. "Regardless, I've never seen anything like that before in my long life, even by Cynthian standards. My, oh my, what a discovery that was! My heart is pounding. I must jot it all down, and then we open another bottle." He quickly sat at the small desk, pulled wide, bound book of parchment from beneath it, dug around for a quill and ink bottle, and hastily began lettering in tiny Cynthian script. Piecora and Karui looked at each other in fear and confusion. Piecora then noticed Kiagri slowly peek his head up from behind Karui's shoulder. He made a little wet click sound and blinked one eyeball. Piecora stood up and said, "I'll check on Venexi. Seems like he's going through some trauma of his own. While you're up, open another bottle. Any will do. This is a grand occasion indeed. The discovery of a new beast from another world," Shadia said absently while writing. He then tossed the small bottle opening mechanism over to Piecora, who clumsily caught it with both hands. "What shall we name it?" he asked everyone, and no one. Piecora awoke from a dream in which she was in her elderly years, showing a large painted map of Canania to a young Sienian girl, gently moving the girl's hand over each of Canania's 7 cities and reciting their names. She had lost count of how many times she slept during the descent, how many meals she had, and how many conversations occurred, either individually or collectively as a group. She saw Shadia in the center of the florm, seated with his head bowed in meditation. She sat up and rolled her neck around in circular motions to relieve stiffness, then stretched her arms and legs. "About a week," said Shadia sleepily, "since we began our descent, but soon we will arrive. Very soon. You will know." It unnerved Piecora that Shadia seemed to read her mind and spoke from within his slumber. Venexi sat at the small desk, writing with the ink and quill on loose parchment that came with the submersible craft. "What are you writing?" Piecora asked. "Shadia inspired me to record notes of events, ideally as they happen or soon after, while the experience is fresh. I'm also writing a letter to Alice, in case something happens to me. It'll be found on my body and delivered to her." "I told him about my career as a scholar and archsage of the pinnacle," said Shadia groggily, rousing from his meditation. "How important writing is in every society and how good it can be for someone personally. Writing validates our experiences, gives purpose to our lives and meaning to ourselves. For many, had they not written anything down, they would have been forgotten." "I wouldn't mind that at all, to be forgotten," Piecora said, while standing up and walking over to the food supplies. "I'm nobody special." "Maybe not, or maybe you are," Shadia said. "Learning to write, and read for that matter, requires years of study that only the privileged can afford. I was lucky to be born into a family with connections to an education. Can you read at all?" "No," said Piecora, lifting a branch of red grapes from a cooled satchel. "Not letters anyway, but I can read the lands and the weather, and I can read the ground and the signs of what happened there. I can also get you across the wildlands safely if you ever care to visit Canania. I do love the maps they draw there. Beautifully painted maps, very expensive. I cannot read them, but I love to look at them and compare their shapes to the places I've been." She tossed a few grapes to Hero, who hopped to catch each one in his beak. "You never told me this," Serpentis said quietly in her mind. You should go see Rolton when this is all through. His shop has many different maps made by some of the most gifted hands in Cananaya, and I can put in a good word for you, get you a discount." Still nothing I could afford, most likely. Piecora shrugged and responded in thought. "I've seen how much your maps go for. If we survive this adventure, you'll be able to afford anything you like," Serpendus said. "Let us discuss that when we—" Piecora stopped her train of thought and dropped the branch of grapes onto the blankets at her feet. She leaned forward with her hands pressed against the curved crystalline side and stared outside the submersible craft in awe. A glow, imperceptible at first, bloomed softly into existence beneath the flame as it continued its steady descent. There were no features outside of the craft, just an endless void of nothingness that began to take on subtle, soft, shifting gradients of deep blue, green, and purple hues all around them. The others woke from their slumber and stared like children outside the capsule on all sides, at the hazy, formless nebula slowly materializing within the immense vastness and nothingness outside the flame. "Behold, Eilhanther Ushie, the infinite plane of water," Shadia said, turning his head to look outside. "It has been so long since I beheld its beauty." "I feel like I'm in a dream," said Piecora breathlessly, her face lit by the shifting hues from the outside. "What is even down here?" "Many things," said Shadia, "but there is no bottom. Descend too far, and you pass into fire." The flame continued its descent down into the silent, shapeless void until Piecora noticed something new happening all around the craft. Thin striations and angular filaments of white, like scrawling cracks in glass, matriculated around the flame within the surrounding ether. Light crackling sounds, like crumpling paper from a distance, were heard throughout the capsule, accompanied by a soft moaning, like thawing ice on a frozen lake. "What is happening?" she asked worriedly as she stared outside. "We are now entering her domain," Shadia responded calmly. The tendrils of filaments grew in thickness and composition all around the crystal craft, obscuring the otherwise featureless void of the surrounding water plane. "Is this ice?" asked Karui, her hands pressed against the glass. "It is so cold." "It is like ice," answered Shadia. "However, it is not temperature that causes the crystallization, but the deterioration of time." The flame continued downward through the thickening, fractalized tendrils of crystallization until a new incandescence began to emerge beneath the craft, stretching outward in all directions like the glow from an imperceptible flaw. Resembling the color of the horizon during sunset, the glow was of pale orange and yellow, formless and undefined, that now lit the craft and the surrounding coalescence from beneath. At the same time, everyone felt a slight shuddering within the sides of the flame, as the frozen sinews and capillaries of decaying time continued rising upward past the craft in its descent. Now there appeared a faint shimmering all around them, like a heat mirage or one's warm breath on a cold morning. It became warm inside the crystalline craft, and the light crackling sounds of crystallization were now accompanied by deep, muffled rumbling. "Shadia, now what?" asked Karui as she snapped her hands from the flame's curved side. "The sides are now hot." "We're almost there," Shadia said, raising his voice over the rising, undefinable bass tones that now filled their ears. "Bogean Cremarane lives near the bottom of Eilhanther Ushi, close to the border of Eilhanther Doithlea, the plane of fire. We are safe. Trust me." The flame shuddered more intensely, groaning and rattling from the conflicting outside pressures, temperatures, and elements, while it descended into the time-decaying crystallization of the surrounding water. The temperatures continued to rise inside the craft, making the companions perspire from heat and anxiety. All around them now, the hastening synthesis of frozen time, extreme pressures, and the intermingling of opposing elements surrounding the outer perimeter of Bogian Cremaran's lair continued to intensify until their surroundings merged into a solid funnel of amalgamated crystal in the exact shape as the flame, lit underneath by the glow of the near-distant plane of fire. But as the craft dropped steadily further, the shuddering diminished, the thunderous sound became distant, and the temperatures slowly cooled. The bright orange glow of the plane of fire below receded and eventually disappeared, leaving them within an eerie glow of green, blue, and violet lit from the surrounding crystalline structure. "It's like we're back inside of Aeonwyrm," Karui said softly. She pressed her hands against the smooth, cool curvature of the flame again and shivered. Piecora gently wrapped a blanket around her friend's shoulders and arms. "Very much so," said Shadia. "Aeonwyrm was not built by hands. It was grown during the violent tumults of Cynthia's creation, like Bogian Cremaran's home here beneath the lake of frozen time in the pre-beginning before the coming of Aeonwyrm. It was Bogian Cremaran who then taught us how to harness and manipulate light, sound, and the elements through gemcraft." The flame continued its descent for a long while inside the crystalline shaft as the bright green and violet hues gradually darkened into deeper blues that encompassed all highlights and infiltrated all shadows. The passengers grew sleepy again within the chilled capsule until each of them drifted into sleep beneath the blankets. Piecora awoke with a start, fearing at first that the crystalline capsule had cracked and both water and fire were rushing in. But quickly she realized that all was still and silent in the deep blue darkness. Looking around inside the flame, she saw her friends still fast asleep beneath the blankets. Hero was curled up on her chest, fidgeting in some dream, and Kiagri was balled up against Karui's head. Vinexi slept with his arm bent upward and his hand hovering over his face, reminding Piecora of how Serpendis used to sleep. Slowly, quietly, she raised herself to a seated position and realized that Shadia was not there among them. She felt cold air against her face through an opening in the side of the capsule, and as her mind cleared and her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw that they were no longer contained within the crystalline funnel. Rather, they were inside a dark, wide-open space filled with faint green and blue bioluminescence. She crept quietly to the opening in the side of the capsule and saw they were in the middle of a large cavern with flickering specks of the bioluminescent lights like constellations of stars. The air was frigid cold, and she could see the steam from her breath. There was no sound at all except for the vague, distant, barely perceptible creaking of the surrounding crystal cavern. The submersible flame rested within a circular pool of dark, still water that mirrored the capsule in perfect duplicity. Piecora looked down and saw her face peering back at her like a ghostly visage from the pool's still surface. Near the flame stood Shadia with his back turned. He stood on the central island of dark crystal that ringed the circular pool in which the flame floated. Around this central island was an outer lagoon of calm water that perfectly reflected the luminescent constellations above. Piecora felt vertigo as she briefly questioned her own perspective of what was real and what was reflection. This outer ring of water stretched far into the darkness until it met the base of the surrounding cavern walls. Shadia drew out a thin wooden pipe and blew a soft, mournful tune of repeated notes that reverberated throughout the cavern. The notes overlapped with each other until the repetition of sound emulsified and filled the cavern, slightly rippling the smooth surface of the surrounding lagoon according to the rebounding sound waves of the echoing notes. Piecora felt the others awaken from the flute's song and gathered around her, peering out from the floam. Then Hero flew out from over their heads and circled around the darkened heights of the cavern until finally coming to rest on top of the floam. He chittered in the freezing air while trying to make sense of his surroundings and the strange sounds around him. Shadia broke off his playing, and he turned to face them as the echoing song slowly dissipated into silence. He held his wooden pipe straight out to his side and said, "Welcome, my friends, to Baal Eknater, Na Hygroichta, lair of the Infinity Serpent. Bogean Kremaran knows we are here. Soon she will summon us." He walked toward the craft, held out his hand, and said, "Careful with your step exiting the floam. The water is very cold, and if you fall in, you'll be lost." Piecora grasped his hand and carefully stepped out from the crystalline craft after feeling like she spent weeks inside it. She strode around the small island ring that surrounded the pool in which the floam floated, stretching out her legs and arms and twisting her torso back and forth to work out the kinks along her spine. Before she realized it, she was shivering uncontrollably from the freezing cold air. A heavy, warm, hooded cloak was laid around her, and turning, she saw it was Karui, who was herself wrapped in a similar cloak. "I found these among the supplies in there," she said. "One for each of us, plus more." "Thank you, old friend," Piecora said, still shivering. "Scythians think of everything, don't they?" "I suppose if you did something for thousands of years, you would too," Karui answered, her voice trembling from the frozen air of the crystalline cavern. Thick puffs of steam came with each exhale from all of them as they gathered outside the floam on the small crystalline island. If Serpendis could only have seen this, Piecora wondered aloud while gazing up at the bioluminescent stars above. "I can see everything," he replied within her mind. "I am still with you." "Not as talkative as you used to be, are you, old man?" Piecora mused. "I almost miss it." "Less reason to be with each passing moment," Serpendis said. The sound of crackling ice suddenly caught all their attention, and on one side of the island the water began crystallizing into a narrow strip of solid ice that led from the island to the outer crystalline wall of the lagoon. Within the wall, a dark, round opening appeared, large enough to fit several people side by side. Before stepping onto the bridge, Shadia turned to look at the others and said, "Careful, don't slip." One by one, they each slowly crossed the wide lagoon of calm, black, reflective water and entered the opening within the cavern wall. The tunnel was a perfectly round tube that went straight and sloped upward for several hundred meters until it opened into a gargantuan cavern of such impossible size and immensity that none of the companions had ever encountered before. They stood on a wide, open, uneven shore of granulated crystalline sand that descended gently into a smooth, flat, dark sea that stretched far into the unknown darkness beyond. The immeasurably distant, vitreous walls and ceiling of the astronomic lair also disappeared into darkness. Like the previous cave, countless specks of bioluminescence covered the ceiling, floor, and sides, providing the cavern with a weak ambience of deep blue and green. The air was unbelievably freezing cold, and occasionally a strong breeze would bring sheets of moisture from the lake. Hero was tucked inside Piecora's cloak, and Kiagri also stayed hidden within Karui's cloak, peeking his amphibian head out from time to time, only to quickly recoil. There was no sound inside the subterranean sea lair, except for the breathing and nervous shuffling of the tiny companions on the glassy shoreline bordering the wide-open, calm, black sea. Shadir stood at the edge of the waterline with his hands folded behind his back as the sea wind billowed his ornate, heavy cloak of brown, green, and blue with gold filigree clasped around his neck with a gold brooch in the shape of the infinity serpent. The others gathered behind him and looked around nervously while shivering in the damp cold. Then, from somewhere deep within the colossal lair, came a heavy thump that they felt in their boots through the vibrating, crystal-speckled shore. Then, after several moments, there came another deep thump, followed by another. Several smaller clicks then followed in rapid succession. Locating the source of these sounds was impossible, as they seemed to emanate from all directions within the lair itself. Karui then pointed to a space in the distance over the water. The companions saw a brief, circular disturbance ripple the surface of the sea. Its concentric wavelets took several moments to reach the crystal shoreline, and then it happened again, and then a third time. Piecora realized the disturbances aligned with the deep thumps they heard, taking long moments for the sounds to finally reach the water's surface and break through. There came another series of clicks followed by a deep, low groan that permeated the surrounding crystalline walls. The shoreline vibrated more intensely beneath their boots. Additional disturbances in the water lapped gently against the crystal shore until finally, quietly, and slowly, they all perceived a large lump appearing in the distant darkness of the sea, barely visible by the cavern's luminescent lighting. Coinciding with the rising lump came more thumps, now in a steady rhythm followed by another volley of clicks. Finally, a great shape broke the water's surface as another low groan originating from beneath the water became a loud, rumbling growl. It passed into open air and resonated throughout the lair, trembling the foundation of the crystalline sea cavern's infrastructure. Small glints of crystal debris rained down the ceiling above. The thing continued rising as it moved forward and lifted its great head above them, revealing a massive reptilian snake-like countenance, its face pure white, as if painted like a death mask. The edges of the stark white mask churned and swirled fluidly against ever-changing chromatophores of gray, green, and blue that boiled in constant, animated metacrosis over its gargantuan serpentine body like massive, distant storms as it continued rising into the air many stories high. Horns extruded from its brow, head, and beneath its lower jaw, starting white at their base and fading to black at their points. Large feathers billowed from behind its horns on top of its head and around its face, also fading from white at their source to black at their tips. Its large reptilian eyes were opaque, milky white with a hint of blue-green frost. The gargantuan trunk of its scaled neck, about 30 meters wide, towered over the companions like a massive pillar silently rising from the sea. Its head, almost reaching the ceiling, looked down on the companions from several hundred meters high. It suddenly exhaled in a deafening release of long-stored air that instigated an abrupt change of climate within the upper reaches of the cavern. Mists quickly formed and flowed around the sea serpent's mighty head, lit by luminescent lights in the ceiling. And flurries began to fall in the cavern from the newborn weather system, coating the companions and the crystalline shore with fine flakes of snow that blew in the cavern's swirling winds. Waves washed over the crystal shore, causing the companions to backpedal, slip, and fall until they flattened themselves against the diaphanous wall behind them. Throughout all of this, Shadir stood unmoving with his arms outstretched over his head, dwarfed by the towering monstrosity before him. Finally, the trunk descended slowly until the serpent's enormous head lowered to Shadia's level. It exhaled again through its two massive nostrils set within its elongated reptilian white face, and Shadia's cloak and hair blew back violently. Its huge feathers adorning its head and trailing along the back of its neck flexed, shifted, and twisted, detecting frequencies and vibrations like a cat adjusts its ears to hear sounds from different directions. More heavy thumps, loud enough to have physical presence, emanated from the giant sea serpent that shook everyone within their very cores. These were followed by bone-rattling clicks that rang from side to side across the cavern. A long groan infiltrated the clicks until a set of recognizable syllables emerged. Shadia, in the Scythian tongue. At no point during any of these vocalizations did the massive creature open its long, snake-like mouth. Serpendis recognized the concussive thumps, groans, and clicks as an ancient, long-form predecessor of the Abrignalian language. Shadia knelt and lowered his head to the water's edge in reverence as the giant sea serpent spoke again. "Who have you brought to me, Shadia?" it demanded in Scythian. "We bring gifts, Bogean Cremaran," said another voice entirely from behind them all, responding also in Scythian. A figure wearing a heavy brown cloak with a deep cowl strode into the cavern from the same tunnel used by the companions. "The gifts you requested that will complete your ritual, destroy Anmara and Fornir the Gal, and save Cynthia from extinction. It's all here for you now." Piecora crouched against the crystalline wall, shivering from cold, fear, and shock, and clutching Hero close to her chest for both his warmth and her own sanity. She was covered in snow, and her hair was wet and matted around her face as she stared in stunned astonishment at Tukurai, the hermit of Sienya and hierophant druid, stepping into the lair of the Infinity Serpent. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.